Well, you're back. Good to see you. Welcome to part 2 of the series on exposing Watchtower Society's interpretive abuse. I left off in part 1 asking my Jehovah's Witness visitors to explain Matthew 13 and 44, Jesus' parable of the hidden treasure, which I'll read again as follows. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like unto treasure hidden in a field, which when a man has found, he hides, and for the joy thereof goes and sells all that he has, and buys that field. Matthew 13:44. After asking their views on this parable, I run the following fabricated, creative, hopefully, hypothetical scenario by them. I say, imagine you, as a Jehovah's Witness, are confronted by two men, elders dressed in black, who see this passage as support for the Mormon religion. They explain that Joseph Smith discovered a treasure of gold plates while walking in a field in upstate New York in the year 1827. They immediately add that Joseph Smith buried these plates. He hid them, but later, after fully dedicating himself totally to God's kingdom, he returned to unearth them. Then they explain that these plates were later translated into what we know today as the Book of Mormon. You're then asked to compare Matthew 13:44 with Ezekiel 37 and 16, which talks about the stick or the book of Joseph. I'm sure most of you have heard of that. Okay, then I stop and I ask my visiting witnesses, what might they say to these elders? Number one, to discredit their interpretation, and two, to set them straight on what this passage actually means. And after listening to their ideas, if they have any, which I doubt, I explain how I would handle this situation. I say, firstly, before I would even tackle the elders' understanding, I would introduce them to my basic guidelines for validating doctrinal claims. Then I would use these 4 guidelines to demonstrate that their explanation of Matthew 13:44 is not biblical. It's not a biblical interpretation, but an extra-biblical interpolation. That they are in fact guilty of interpretive abuse, not only for ignoring the context and arbitrarily linking unrelated passages, Ezekiel with Matthew, what do they got to do with each other? But also for tampering with and impregnating the text by superimposing their own church history, names, Joseph Smith, dates, 1827, places, upstate New York, right onto the Bible. And then I would apply sound biblical interpretive practice, and that of letting the Bible interpret itself. I would tell them that this parable is one of 7, mostly field parables. 4 out of the 7 are field parables, spoken by Jesus to the multitude from a boat. Now, there's the parable of the sower sowing seed in his field, the parable of the weeds in the field, the parable of the mustard seed, which a man planted in his field, and this one, a man walking in the field who finds and hides the treasure until he buys the field. Now, unlike Jesus' vineyard parables that apply specifically to Israel, these parables, these field parables, pertain to the church. The kingdom of heaven is like, okay, and actually foresee the development of the church throughout history. It would grow large like a mustard seed, an enormous mustard seed tree. So it covers history right to the consummation, when angels gather the righteous harvest of the earth. Now, the master key to interpreting Matthew 13:44 is found in the parallel passage, which is found in the 4th chapter of Mark's Gospel. The same incident. In the 13th verse, after Jesus gets out of the boat, and the disciples ask him to explain the parable of the sower, and Jesus says to them, if you don't understand this field parable, how will you understand any parable? So we know that all the parables in Mark 4 and Matthew 13 are related as to interpretation. Now, the individual keys to interpreting the parable of the treasure in the field are found in the explanation that Jesus provides in other parables. and the other field parables found in Matthew 13. In verse 38 of Matthew 13, Jesus says the field is the world. The man in the field, he says, is the Son of Man. That's both the verse in 37 and also verse 24. The treasure, or the good seed, are the children of the kingdom. Verse 38. The children of the kingdom are the church. So, the correct interpretation of this particular kingdom of heaven field parable is this. The Son of Man is the man walking in the field, the world. He sees the treasure, and for the joy set down before him, gives everything he has to purchase the field, or the world, to acquire his hidden treasure. A treasure that was hidden even from the prophets. If you see, look at that at verse 17. His hidden treasure being, of course, the church. So now I'm ready to ask my witness visitors some questions. I ask, do you agree that the elders' beliefs about this passage are not biblical? That they're in fact the product of interpretive abuse and really represent extra-biblical teachings of men? Then I ask them, do you think that either my pointing out their interpretive abuse or providing them with sound exegesis on this passage might help to change the elders' views? Now, however the witnesses respond, you can say that you believe that neither pointing out the interpretive abuse nor providing sound exegesis would change their thinking. Because their primary faith of these elders is in their church leadership and not in the Bible. And if they did change their thinking on this parable, they would probably be labeled as apostates, disfellowshipped, and shunned by their friends and family. What do you think? Well, I'd say, as I close here, I would say I'm glad that at least we all can see that their teachings here are in fact the product of interpretive abuse. And they really represent the extra-biblical teachings of men. We have agreed on that. But looking at your religion now, is it possible that the religion of Jehovah's Witnesses is entirely founded on similar interpretive abuse? Now it's time to introduce Watchtower Society Fables Mythology. I understand that 1935 is an important year for your organization. What happened in 1935? How did your organization realize that the heavenly class was numerically complete in 1935? I know you've changed in 2007, but how did they come to that knowledge? And I understand that 1918 and 1919 were important years for your religion. What happened in 1918 and 1919, according to the Bible? Be sure you ask if these dates are biblical and how their organization might have come by this knowledge. And you'll find out it's pure speculation. Go for the details and be sure to ask them how they know these things actually happened. And keep on hand the Society's quotes for these dates. Ask them to show where all this detailed information is found in the Bible. And conclude by informing that you cannot accept these teachings because they are, in fact, extra-biblical. I hope that you've enjoyed this approach and that you can take something from this series to use in your ministry. And thank you for listening today.